Hi, students, and welcome to the Lambin Flat Riot, which may have been some of the most early forms of racism we have in Australia, apart from the obvious interactions with some of the Aboriginals. The Lambin Flat Riot involved Australian diggers and European diggers and all sorts of diggers interacting in very poor ways with the Chinese. Okay, so we had the gold rush, and the people came from all over the world to Australia, mostly Victoria, very key, all came to Victoria mostly, all coming down here, because that's where most of the gold was, and of course you had many of these guys come as well. Here they are, the Chinese, they came as well, and of course the Chinese looked quite different to your standard European, okay? Most of the Australians and Europeans and Italians, they all looked quite similar to each other. I mean, they looked a little bit different, but the Chinese people looked quite different. I mean, you can see it's obvious. Chinese people look different to your standard European, your standard English, your Irish, even your Italians. Chinese people are a whole different sort of, they have a whole different type of look about them, okay? Now, the Aussie diggers and the European diggers and the American diggers and the Irish diggers, and I've got them here. Like, there's an Irish digger, there's an English digger, there's an Italian digger, just a standard white person. They did not generally like the Chinese. In fact, this is a great paragraph, and I'm just going to read it. There were many things that made the European miners dislike the Chinese miners on the goldfields in the 1850s. Most of the trouble was the way the Chinese miners looked for gold. The gold was alluvial gold, that means surface gold, close to the surface. It was found in very old riverbeds called leads, which had been buried for thousands of years. Getting the gold did not need much skill, but it was hard work. Right, European miners worked alone or in small groups. They often left one area of ground to dig in another, where others said there was more gold. Right, many gold miners did not make enough money to buy food and clothing. Only a few miners became rich. Okay, so the Chinese usually worked in large groups of 30 to 100 men. This is different to your more standard European diggers. These guys who used to work just in pairs or threes and fours, okay? The Chinese, right, these guys, they were able to share the small amounts of gold they found. They looked for gold on land that other miners had searched before, and this quite ticked off these European guys, the Aussies, the Englishmen, the Americans. The European miners thought that the land was still their land, even though they'd left it. The Chinese miners lived and worked together. Most of them had been farmers in China. They were used to long hours of hard work, and they were used to basic food and houses. Now, the Europeans weren't like this. They didn't work together. They weren't used to the sort of hard work that the Chinese were perhaps used to. The Chinese were also happy to find a lot of small pieces of gold, right here, instead of looking for just one big piece that would make them rich. So the Chinese would just all work together, and they would all share the gold that they got. And they worked very well. They worked very hard and industriously, and they actually found a lot of gold that European diggers didn't. And this made the European diggers pretty unhappy. Oh, see, unhappy man here. Oh, not clone. Unhappy diggers, see? Okay, and you can see the European diggers, they've all got sad frowns on them now. They don't look like very good sad frowns, do they? I might have to improve this sad frown right here. Looks like a moustache. Yeah, that's a bit better. Right, they're all sad. Of course, the Chinese diggers are happy because they found lots of gold. Okay, and so you should be able to see there's all sorts of reasons the Europeans, the Australians, the Americans didn't like the Chinese diggers. I mean, they're in large numbers, the Chinese diggers, and look, let's talk about this as well. We have to talk about this. The Chinese diggers look different. I mean, look at this guy's face here. Look at his face here. Look at his face here. You should be able to see that his face is very different. It's a very different bone structure. It looks very different once again to all the other faces there. So, this was one of the first times that Europeans had really come into contact with the Chinese, and they probably didn't like people who looked very different to them, like the Chinese did, and who were very different to them, succeeding so well. And this is this is a word that we know. There's certainly an element probably of racism on the goldfields, and that's when you treat someone poorly because of their race. And the Chinese were a different race to the Europeans. Okay, they're a part of the different race of human beings. I mean, we're all humans, but there's races within humanity, different types of people and human beings. And the Chinese are a different race to the Europeans, and the Europeans didn't like people who were a different race to them succeeding so well on the gold fields. And I mean, as well as that, the Chinese dress very differently. They wear these funny hats, they had these funny dogs, they wore funny clothes, they ate funny foods, except it wasn't really funny foods, it was just different, and their hats kept them well out of the sun. So there's lots of different reasons why the European diggers did not like the Chinese on the gold fields. Right, so the European miners rioted. Here we go. The most well-known riot took place, there it is, on the night of the 30th of June 1861. A group of 3,000 miners, European white miners, basically white miners, marched to Lambin Flat, which is a flat near Ballarat. It's just a big gold field there. They forced the Chinese to leave. They chased them off. Okay, they fought with them. They punched. They kicked them. Tents were set on fire, and items belonging to the Chinese were smashed or stolen. Then they went to the Back Creek diggings, which are more diggings in Ballarat, and they set fire to more Chinese tents. Many of the Chinese were cruelly beaten, but no one was actually killed. About 1,200 Chinese left the area and set up another camp at Currawong, 20 kilometres away. So two things started the riot. In Sydney, the Parliament did not pass an anti-Chinese law that the diggers wanted to be passed, and thank goodness for that. They didn't ban the Chinese from coming in the country. And also an untrue story ran around the goldfields that said a group of 1,500 Chinese were on the way to Bungarong, which is where the diggers were staying at that point. So basically they were just angry that more Chinese were coming in. But it's very interesting because the Irish didn't have a problem with the Italians, and the Italians didn't have a problem with the English, and the English didn't have a problem with the Australians, but they all had a problem with the Chinese. So really, you have to think that there was certainly a bit of racism going on there. So look, let's sum that up. There was a riot at Lambin Flat. And I got that wrong, guys. I said Lambin Flat was near Ballarat in Melbourne. Lambin Flat's actually here, closer to Sydney, okay? But we focus on this particular riot because this one was the most significant of the anti-Chinese riots, okay? And there was a riot at Lambin Flat, and basically, to sum it up, the Europeans were jealous of the Chinese as the Chinese were finding more gold. Okay, they were just better at it. Also, the Europeans were sometimes racist towards the Chinese. There's no doubt about it. They seemed to be angry at the Chinese more than they were angry at each other. So the Aussies tended to tolerate with the English, and the English tended to tolerate the Italians, but they all sort of hated the Chinese. So you have to think there was a bit of racism going on there. Why? Because the Chinese, well, they looked different, there's no doubt. They had very different routines. You can explore that yourself a little if you like. And the Chinese ate different foods. They just were different. And it's the sad truth about humanity, Year 5. We tend to be a bit suspicious of those who are different of us. So, why do we focus on this? Why was this perhaps the most significant event coming out of the Australian gold rush? Well, guys, you can make up your own mind with regards to the Lambin Flat riot. How is this significant? Is it significant? Well, look, arguably it's the first event of group racism in Australia. English, Irish, Europeans worked together to attack Chinese, which is, I think, pretty uncool because it wasn't a war. It was just trying to find gold on the Australian goldfields, and the Chinese had every much as a right to be there as the English and the Irish and the rest of them. Has this event coloured the way we view immigrants or different cultures in Australia today? I mean, that's something to think about. How do you view different cultures, people who eat different foods, people who look different to you? Is there something about you that's a little bit the same as the Australians or the European diggers from the goldfields? I mean, have a think about that, guys. It's definitely something to think about. So here's the big question. Was the Lambin Flat riot the most significant thing that happened on the goldfields in relation to Australia's history. Okay, guys, thanks for listening.